then the authorities start to become somewhat upset because it also brings about the idea that if they're going to the coffee house to drink coffee, they may not be coming to the mosque to pray.
Oh, okay.
So at various points during Islamic history in the 16th and 17th century, coffee is banned in the Islamic world.
Oh, I see.
Wow. Welcome to Al-Hakam Inspire. Our guest today is Dr. Hammad Khan, who by profession is a consultant neonatologist at St. Thomas and Evelina Children's Hospital. He's also director for the medical services at Humanity First UK. Aside from his medical duties, Dr. Hammad hosts The Weekend World, which is a current affairs show on the Voice of Islam UK radio. He's also an avid coffee lover, coffee drinker, and some may argue, a connoisseur. He's a coffee enthusiast, and today we'll be talking to him about coffee in today's podcast, the history of coffee, the background, the different types of coffee, and how to make the perfect brew. Dr. Hammad Khan, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast.
Oh, wa alaikum salam, Hisham and Hammad. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be talking about coffee, I have to say. I'm not sure if I'd describe myself as a connoisseur. Certainly I'm not. I want everyone to get excited about coffee, so I don't want to come across as a coffee elitist, and I think that there is something about Muslims, and especially Muslims from the Indian subcontinent, taking back coffee as a part of their cultural heritage, and something hopefully we get to talk about today. And I think that coffee has a richly intertwined history as far as Islam is concerned, and that's part of what I want to get into, as well as all of the exciting stuff about why coffee is so amazing and how to make good coffee and everything else that you mentioned.
That's great. No, I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I was actually for the past years, we've always heard that coffee has, like you said, a very important aspect in Islamic history. So if you could just touch upon it, what is the history of coffee, and maybe just also, if you can, how has coffee and caffeine changed the world?
Wow, that's a big question. Has coffee changed the world? Origins of coffee, and this is really, really fascinating for anyone who really thinks about coffee and enjoys coffee and is thinking, so where did coffee start? Because you might think, okay, well, it's probably like a lot of things that came from the New World. Maybe it came from South America, because we've got tomatoes and chilies and chocolate. They all came from the New World. So then maybe coffee came from the New World as well, because Brazil, they grow huge amounts of coffee beans in Brazil. In fact, Brazil still, really since the end of the 19th century up until now, is the biggest coffee producer in the world. But actually, the origins of coffee are in Africa.
Oh, really?
And like a lot of things, there is a deep hidden history there as well. And no one is entirely sure, but around about the area of the historical Abyssinia, which is modern day Ethiopia, Eritrea, there is a plant which is grown, which is the wild version of coffee, and it's ubiquitous to that part of the world, and even now the cultivated form of coffee, some of the best coffee that you can buy, coffee beans that you can buy, come from an area of central Ethiopia called Irgachev. Wow. And East Africa, many would argue, and my own love story, if you like, with coffee comes from East Africa. Many would argue that East Africa is the birthplace of coffee and the place where you can still buy the best coffee. And no one's really sure when people started drinking coffee. And it probably goes back many, many centuries, actually possibly even thousands of years. No one's really sure. The coffee shrub, the bush, would have been there in the wild, and like with many plants, that people would have noticed the medicinal properties of it. The legend is fascinating, though. So the legend goes that there is a goat herd there in Ethiopia, in Abyssinia, called Kaldi. And he's out one day with his goats, and he's calling his goats because he needs to get back home, and they're not responding. So he's like, I have to go and find the goats. So he goes off to try and find the goats, and he finds them underneath the shade of a particular tree. And they seem to be going absolutely ballistic. They're jumping around, they're butting their heads against each other, and they're just getting very, very excited. And he's like, I'm not sure what's going on. This is a bit crazy. And he noticed that they have been chewing on the red berries of the tree that they are dancing around underneath. So he's like, oh gosh, they've taken something. It's probably poison. They're going to die. So then he waits. And eventually they settle down, and he takes them, and they don't die. And the next day he brings them back, and they go straight for the same tree again. They're really excited. They want to eat this berry, and they eat the berry, and the same thing happens. Then he's like, well, if the goats didn't die, maybe I can try it. So he tries something. It's really bitter. The leaves are really bitter, but he tries the fruit, and the fruit is quite sweet, and there's a bit of flesh around the seed, and he eats that, and then he eats the seed, and he feels refreshed, and he feels really energetic, and it's like, oh, this is amazing. And then he takes takes it to his dad, and he says to his dad, oh, Dad, this is amazing, you should try it. And this is all legend, of course. It's over the years, over the centuries, it's become burnished somewhat, shall we say, in the retelling.
Yeah.
But I just think it's a fantastic story. And eventually the legend goes on to say that a local monk, some say, depending on the time at which the story is supposed to be located, perhaps a Muslim ascetic, came to learn about it and thought it was amazing because it would allow them to stay up at night and focus on their zikr, focus on their prayer. And so this then becomes part of the deeply entrenched religious connotations around coffee. And the legend of Kaldi, whether it's true or not, tells you something about the fact that it was deeply entrenched within the culture of that part of the world. But it's not until we get to the 14th and 15th century that we really start to see the cultivation of coffee in a way where it really starts to be cultivated and grown and then processed as a drink. And that's when things really start to change. But even before that, we have got Muslim scholars who talk about coffee, and Abu Bakr al-Razi writes about it in the 9th century, and Ibn Sina, who is, to anyone who knows, and in the Western world, he was a
huge coffee advocate, Ibn Sina. Yeah. I know he used to drink a lot as well.
And some say that he, Avicenna's textbook of medicine was still used in Europe up until the 15th century. So many people talk about him as the father of modern medicine in many ways. And Ibn Sina talks about coffee, and he said it fortifies the organs, it cleans the skin, it dries up the humidities that are under it, and gives an excellent smell to the body. So he was a big advocate of coffee. Yeah. And so we start to see coffee as being very much part of the culture. But as I said, it's not until the 15th century when coffee starts to be grown in Yemen.
Okay.
So that's across the Red Sea from Abyssinia, and not a big difference for anyone who you glance at a world map. You get from Abyssinia to the across to Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And they're absolutely perfect environment for growing coffee. And it's cultivated there, and it's grown there, and it really starts to become a business. And traders get involved, and they're trading both from Abyssinia and from Yemen, where it's being grown. And really then it becomes a ubiquitous part of Islamic culture and spreads throughout the Islamic world, including into Persia, Egypt, Turkey, North Africa, and through to the Indian subcontinent as well. And so there's a really interesting account, and this is before it becomes popular in Europe. So well before anyone's heard of it in Europe. So for those of us from who trace our ancestry back to the Indian subcontinent, we have an account from 1616 of an English reverend called Edward Terry, and he spends time in Mughal South India.
Hmm.
And he wrote about something that he found quite incredible. And he wasn't, so no one in Europe really knew about coffee at the time. And he
Hmm.
said many of the people there in India use a liquor they call coffee. It's made by a black seed boiled in water, which turns it almost the same color, but it doesn't change the taste or make the taste of the water bad. But notwithstanding, it's very good to help digestion, to quicken the spirits, and to cleanse the blood. So we have here within the wider Islamic empires, coffee being an intrinsic part of the culture.
Mm.
And then really, as the 16th century rolls on, we see coffee, as I said, becoming a ubiquitous part of Islamic culture, and the rise of coffee houses. And I think this is really, really fascinating.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention that it's really interesting that you mentioned about how coffee had an impact on the Muslims and in prayers, because I was just having a read that
Yeah.
in the 15th century there are some certain Sufi monasteries in Yemen, when you mentioned is so close to Ethiopia. These Sufi monasteries in Yemen, they employed coffee actually as an aid, actually to concentrate in prayers as well. So that was something quite interesting,
Yeah.
and it quite actually relates to what you were speaking about.
So that's right. And it is very interesting that it started off having this significant religious connotation.
Yeah.
Mm.
And then from there it moves on to become a much more secular thing in a way. And
Yeah.
actually then also leads to a backlash, interestingly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because what happens is that it starts off with the Sufis who are drinking it, as you said, to allow them to focus and concentrate during prayer, and especially through the night. They drink coffee, they can stay up all night and pray. Then people start drinking, everyone starts drinking it, and it becomes, as we said, it becomes a thing that everyone does.
Yeah.
And there is another 16th century scholar from the Yemen port of Mocha, where we get the word mocha for coffee from.
Yeah.
And he wrote, coffee is the common man's gold, and like gold, it brings to every man the feeling of luxury and nobility. Where coffee is served, there is grace and splendor and friendship and happiness. So you can really see now coffee changes
Yeah.
in terms of the narrative and the cultural significance of coffee from something which is only for religious purposes to now being a ubiquitous part of what everyone does in the Islamic world. And then you get the rise of coffee houses. And these become places where people come, they exchange news, gossip, I'm sure, intellectual thought, conversations are happening. And conversations of all sorts. And then the authorities start to become somewhat upset because it also brings about the idea that if they're going to the coffee house to drink coffee, they may not be coming to the mosque to pray.
Oh, okay.
So at various points during Islamic history in the 16th and 17th century, coffee is banned in the Islamic world.
Oh, I see.
Wow.
So and banned and then unbanned again.
Yeah, I've read about these prohibition areas actually of coffee. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's fascinating how much of an effect coffee has in respect of the society itself. And you asked the question about how coffee changed the world. Well, we go from there through to the introduction of coffee into Europe, and then that happens in the middle of the 17th century.
You were mentioning about the kind of coffee houses. I just want to kind of bring in the element of tea. I don't completely want to neglect tea there, but tea is also hugely. It's a drink. It's a drink that's been hugely consumed in the Indian and East Asian Asian subcontinent for a long time. And perhaps nowadays we find, particularly people amongst kind of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, they drink more tea than coffee. So was this kind of coinciding with the kind of history of tea, or where does tea come into all of this?
Tea, that's and we can take a slight diversion here, and the history of tea and the reason that tea is ubiquitous in the Indian subcontinent is because of empire,
Right.
because of the British Empire,
Okay.
and really, if so, you heard the quote there from the 1600s, early 1600s, Mughal Empire in India. Everyone drank coffee. They didn't drink tea; they were drinking coffee, and obviously coffee that by that stage had become pretty ubiquitous. Early on, the only way that you could get coffee beans was from Yemen, and the Arabs controlled the trade in coffee. But very quickly, through into the 17th century, you had people smuggling coffee beans that could be grown and coffee plants out of the Arabian Peninsula. And in the first instance, there was an Indian Muslim who went for Hajj. And he went for Hajj and he was like introduced to coffee. And this is amazing, but can I take it with me to grow? And they said, no, you can't do that. So he took some beans and again, stories, but I think this probably has a little bit more to it than the story around Kaldi, the goat herd. He took some beans, he taped them to his stomach to hide them, and then he took them back to India and started growing coffee beans or coffee plants for coffee beans in India in the 17th century. And so coffee starts to become ubiquitous there and is a ubiquitous drink throughout the Muslim world. Once the British Empire started to take hold in the Indian subcontinent, it was around about the same time as the Dutch started to also cultivate coffee. So the Dutch got very excited about coffee. They sent people in to steal coffee plants, and they were successful in stealing those coffee plants. So they took the coffee plants and they initially tried to grow them in Holland, and that was a complete failure. So then the Dutch East Indies, so Indonesia, that's where they started growing it. And even now, you can get coffee from that part of the world, and that's directly as a result of the Dutch. Now, and again, Brazil, these were all elements of empire, and growing coffee plants in Brazil and for beans all started by the 18th century, late 18th century. But just go back to the British. The British were like, well, we want part of this game, right? Everyone wants coffee. So we're going to grow coffee. Where can we grow coffee? And they thought, okay, well, it needs to have a certain environment. It needs to be hot. You need to have some elevation. So they thought, well, South India, yeah, it works. We don't really have enough land there to make this work on scale. So they went for Sri Lanka. And they started to grow coffee plants in Sri Lanka. And initially it was incredibly successful.
Wow.
But there was just something about the environment which meant it was just a little bit too humid. And the coffee plants got hit by a fungal infection and completely wiped out. So all of the coffee crops that the British were trying to grow in India were just completely wiped out. And they said, well, this is a failure. This hasn't worked. What can we grow instead? So they decided to grow tea. And as you said, tea was there. Tea came from China, but tea was there and it was around and people drank it. And tea, and I kind of have the same thing about tea as I have about coffee. Lots of people drink tea. They don't necessarily drink good tea. Lots of people drink coffee. They don't necessarily drink good coffee. So they really started to grow tea on an industrial scale. And because they were growing tea on an industrial scale, they wanted that tea to be consumed en masse. So they did that by having massive tariffs on coffee. So the only alternative was tea. And because tea also has a little bit of caffeine in, not as much as coffee, but it has caffeine in. And because it gives you some of the same hit, as it were, addictive qualities as coffee does, then people really got into tea. And because of that, you get tea drinking as completely ubiquitous in Britain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can go down the local corner shop and pick up a box of Yorkshire tea. It's not actually grown in Yorkshire.
Is it not?
No. And so it's
Right.
Some people find that surprising. It's not actually
Yeah.
grown in Yorkshire, but it is it is that deeply ingrained in
Yeah.
the culture of this country, tea, and then therefore by extension in the Indian subcontinent because of the
Mhm.
massive influence of the British. So coffee was there
Yeah.
first, and then tea took over purely as a function of economy, purely because people wanted to make money.
Mm.
Okay.
And that's how tea drinking came about, and that's why for many of us our parents drink tea, and we're just discovering coffee.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
coffee was in many ways, I think, for people of our parents' generation, seen as a foreign drink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coffee is something that maybe Europeans drink.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You can see kind of my own parents, they were kind of very skeptical of going to coffee. They thought it was too strong, and
Yeah.
they'd drink about
Yes.
10 cups of tea a day, but
Yeah.
wouldn't drink a cup of coffee because that would be the end of it, right?
No, absolutely. And yet, interestingly, if you go to Turkey, coffee's the thing, right? And the
Right.
rituals around coffee are incredible. And we've lost that in the Indian
Mm.
subcontinent. We've lost
Mm.
the cultural significance and the rituals around coffee which would have been there for many, many years. And if you go, you can see pictures, images, which were made in the early 17th century of Ottoman coffee houses. Just going back to this question of coffee houses, Ottoman coffee houses as places where people would come together and they would be drinking coffee and the preparation of coffee and the socialization around coffee. And there's incredible social
Yeah.
spaces, and people would come and they would play board games, they would tell stories, recite poetry, all of those things. And that was a
Yeah. I was reading about this
space,
earlier.
yeah,
Coffee houses are actually a very powerful force that forged actually social revolution. It was like they sprung up these coffee houses which happened in villages, and this was where these types of schools of the wise kind of came in, where if you wanted to know something about what was going on in the world, then the actual place where you would go to is the coffee houses, and the link therefore between like coffee and kind of intellectual life became established. If you ever want to like have a talk, let's just go for a coffee. It kind of links back to that time as well.
Absolutely, and the strength and the power of that kind of socialization around coffee
Yeah.
is very deep within the culture of that part of the world and of the wider Muslim empires during that time, and even as we said, even in Turkey up until now. And that
Mm.
idea of coffee shops as a place where everyone comes together, the sort of the social landscape within that is really, really powerful. And I think it's an interesting flip side to
Hmm.
what would have been in Europe during that time before coffee came in, taverns
Right.
and
Yeah.
places where
Yeah.
people would go to drink alcohol, beer, ale, whatever it was. But of course, alcohol dulls the senses,
Yeah.
whereas
Mm.
coffee sharpens the senses.
Yeah.
Alcohol is a depressant, whereas coffee is a stimulant. And so you've got a completely different effect occurring
Mm.
between an
I,
ale house
yeah.
and a coffee house.
I think at
And
this point
so,
in time,
yeah.
it's also interesting as well to touch upon the neurobiology of coffee as well,
Mm.
because I suppose we're all doctors here. We kind of understand it, how it kind of blocks the adenosine receptors, but it does quite a lot of things. With a
Mm.
lot of these neurotransmitters, it can increase the number of dopamine receptors in the brain, which can increase motivation. I was reading as well that it
Yeah.
actually can increase adrenaline, which explains why some people get jitters when they have coffee,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
obviously in turn activates sympathetic system, widens pupils, and thus increases focus and motivation. So it has a role in neurobiology there as well, which completely explains what you were mentioning as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's fascinating to look at all of the different effects that coffee has, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the medical benefits of coffee.
Yeah.
But I think that around it, the neurobiology, as you say, the effect on the brain is fascinating because
Yeah.
people also worry that coffee is addictive,
Yeah.
and it's almost certainly true to say that it has some addictive properties. Which is to say, if you drink coffee regularly and you stop drinking coffee, you will crave it, and
Yeah.
that's a real effect. And some people will have real and quite significant withdrawal symptoms if they stop drinking coffee. headaches, nausea, and that sort of thing. And those are the hallmarks of a substance that does have some addictive properties. And it's not all upside. So I think it's fair for us to talk about all of the different elements. And whilst coffee has positive effects, you can also become used to coffee and caffeine within coffee. And the effects that has on your body. And so the first time you start drinking it definitely has a positive effect, but it can start to reduce as time goes on. But everyone is different, and it's fascinating because some people metabolize coffee very, very quickly, whereas other people metabolize coffee very slowly. And the people that metabolize coffee slowly tend to accumulate that coffee. So they can't drink more than a couple of cups of coffee today. And if they were to have more than that, then they would have trouble sleeping. They would get jitters. They would get those sympathetic effects. We talk about sympathetic effects, the sort of adrenaline-like effects on the body, which can be negative side effects. The coffee jitters is a real thing.
You were mentioning about the medicinal uses of coffee. We're all doctors here. We understand that, specifically in neonatology, actually, that there is some sort of aspect of it. Could you touch upon that, please? Specifically in like the UK, is there any use of caffeine in the hospital at all?
Yeah, I think now's the point where we start to draw a little distinction between coffee and caffeine.
Yeah,
caffeine is the active agent in coffee, which has a stimulant effect, and it's the kind of the active drug. And like with a lot of medicines that are derived from natural materials, we refine the active agent out of the original thing and then use that. And so caffeine is the active agent within coffee, and it's very well described and has been isolated as a substance for many years. In order to understand how it's so useful in neonatology, you kind of have to take a step back into the history of neonatology. So it's quite fascinating in that respect. And babies have been born preterm and early for as long as humans have been around. And the sad reality is that for a long part of human history, if a child was born preterm, they would die. And there are a number of reasons why they might die, but one of the most significant problems that preterm infants have is with their lungs, and their lungs are not as mature as they should be, and their brains are not as well developed. So that leads to two problems as far as breathing is concerned. One is that the lungs are not as good as getting carbon dioxide out and getting oxygen in, and the blood flow in the lungs is not as good as it should be. And the second is that the brain is not as good at triggering the lungs to do their job. So our respiratory drive in preterm infants is not as good as it is in older children or in adults. Coffee, and it's really fascinating when you look at the research around this, through a series of experiments was discovered to be the one agent that had the most potent effect. Lots of different agents were tried. But when they got to caffeine, the evidence was so clear it was incredible.
Oh,
wow.
And the effects of caffeine are, one, to drive the body to breathe more. So stopping something called apnea of prematurity. And apnea means when the body doesn't breathe. Premature infants, the brain centers aren't as mature, so they don't drive the lungs to breathe as much. Caffeine can stop that apnea from happening. So help the brain to trigger the lungs to breathe, which is fascinating. But it also has several other effects. So caffeine as a stimulant, because you mentioned adrenaline as well, because of some of these secondary effects, it also has incredible effects on the lungs themselves. So can cause the blood flow in the lungs to increase. And in preterm infants, that's a major issue that they have in terms of blood flow and therefore oxygenation and carbon dioxide exchange. So we've found that caffeine is incredibly powerful at keeping preterm babies alive. And once we had discovered this, all preterm babies receive caffeine if they're very premature and if they have lung problems. And the effect of that has been incredible, actually, in terms of the medical benefit of it. And what's also fascinating is those lung effects aren't just limited to preterm babies. So actually, people with asthma, coffee has a significant beneficial effect
Oh,
for
really?
exactly the same reason, because it increases the blood flow and it also causes the muscles inside the airways to relax.
So asthmatics should be drinking more coffee,
They absolutely they should
right?
be. They should be.
I actually have asthma, so I should probably start on that.
What about other? I suppose because it goes back to that same element of a respiratory stimulant. So the caffeine in the coffee and high doses of caffeine are useful for rerouting blood flow to the lungs and encouraging their better breathing, better lung function. I suppose.
Yeah. No,
Right.
that's exactly right.
Right. I just want to kind of come on. Obviously, we've talked about some of the medical uses. There was a really interesting podcast. It was looking at kind of, and it's kind of linking to that point you mentioned earlier, where the possible downsides. I don't really want to say downsides of coffee, but the possible people who become dependent on coffee.
Yeah.
We sometimes find that initially people are can function very well on it, but then you get some individuals who need that coffee hit in the morning. And it was really interesting because recently this has been discussed in a number of podcasts, where what is the optimum time for drinking coffee, and how if you drink it too close to bedtime, it kind of disrupts the circadian rhythm. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that.
So I mean that in itself is also really, really fascinating and is very much an individual thing. So it's very much an individual thing. Within cultures that have a very strong tradition of coffee drinking, then you'll tend to get some sort of generalized rules around coffee drinking. And one of those in some cultures is not to drink coffee after 3:00 in the afternoon or thereabouts, not to drink coffee after the afternoon. And that really is because for some individuals, if you drink coffee that's late in the day, the effects of that coffee, the stimulant effect of the coffee, remains with you even when you get up to bedtime, and therefore can disrupt sleep. And if you're taking coffee, say 5-6 o'clock in the evening, and then you try and get to sleep, you're going to have disturbed sleep. You're not going to sleep as well. Now, some people, they drink coffee before bedtime, and they're out like a light.
Right.
And those are the people who metabolize coffee very, very quickly.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah.
So for them, it makes no difference. They drink coffee. A few minutes later, it's cleared out their system. They're ready to go to sleep. They go to sleep. It probably still has an effect. They probably don't sleep as well as they would otherwise. And so, as a general rule, and you kind of have to learn yourself what is the best thing for you. For me personally, I don't drink coffee after 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. So an absolute rule. And if I do, I see the effects. It's a bad effect in terms of my sleep. If I miss my afternoon coffee, I do wake up with a headache.
Yeah.
I wake up with some withdrawal symptoms. I'm craving my coffee first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
So I normally have my first coffee around about 6 a.m. That's the time when I'm getting up. So 6 a.m. coffee, and then I'm kind of set for the day. And my second coffee of the day will be around sort of 1-2 o'clock in the afternoon. And
how many do you drink in the day?
Two. I don't drink more than 2 coffees a day.
Okay.
And so it's I to be honest, I wish I could drink more because I enjoy drinking coffee, but I've just learned with time that's the optimal amount of coffee for me. And I think you have to do that. You drink too much, you get the side effects, you get jitters, you get problems with habituation, you get problems with withdrawal. If I were to go up to 3-4 cups of coffee a day, I know that I would then really start to suffer with withdrawal symptoms because my body would then crave it every few hours, and it would disturb my sleep. It would disturb, my natural sleep-wake cycle. And I don't want to do that. And so I reduce the amount of coffee that I drink during Ramzan, interestingly, because otherwise I'm drinking coffee essentially all at one time. So say early in the morning and then at iftari time. So I tend to avoid doing that and just drink it once and just let it have its effect. And it does mean that I get withdrawal symptoms for a few days, but then you get over it.
It's interesting that you said that you have a coffee again in the afternoon, because some people actually, if they have it straight after waking up, they experience what's called a caffeine crash. And I was doing some research earlier today, just reading a bit about coffee, and there's some scientists, particularly some neuroscientists like Dr. Andrew Huberman, who says that actually the rule of thumb should be to have coffee about 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking up, because that allows time for adenosine in your body to perform its metabolism and perform it, and then after that, if you have caffeine, then it's kind of more healthy in that aspect, and that will prevent perhaps a caffeine crash.
No, absolutely, and there is absolutely a school of thought, and it's related to adenosine. It's also related to the normal cycle of hormones in our body, and we all have natural levels of stimulant hormones in our body, and those stimulant hormones tend to be at the lowest point in the middle of the night. And so our levels of cortisol in our body are lowest at sort of 3-4 in the morning. And you guys know, because you've done night shifts.
Yeah.
Right? It's the middle of the night, and you're just feeling tired and you're feeling cold.
Yes. Yeah.
That's your cortisol at its lowest level.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And so when you wake up in the morning, your cortisol levels slowly climb up, and then they peak around about an hour after you wake up. And the reason that I drink coffee as soon as I get up is more to do with the fact that I've just got to get my day started, because I don't have time. If I had 90 minutes to lounge around, it'd be great, but I don't. Yeah. So I have to crack on with my day.
I think this leads on to a really nice kind of point that we wanted to discuss, which is we've talked about the history and how coffee has gradually been commercialized. Nowadays, there are so many different types, especially if you don't have time to make your own coffee. You go over to Starbucks, there's Americano, cappuccino, espresso. For a coffee novice, or someone who's looking to start drinking coffee, what are the different types? What is the best way to get started? And for someone who's more of an advanced coffee drinker, how do you kind of create that perfect brew at home or otherwise?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question, and I think the answer to that is if I talk about my own journey into coffee.
That would be great.
And for the longest time, I didn't drink coffee.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I hated coffee. It's horrible.
Really?
So why would you drink coffee? It tastes so bitter.
Yeah, it's bitter at the start.
Unpleasant. So, it's interesting that you say at the start, because I didn't drink coffee because I didn't like the bitter taste, and so I was like, I'm not going to drink this rubbish. And then I was it wasn't until my mid-30s. And I went to Uganda, and I was there with Humanity First, actually, and I was there doing some work with local hospitals, and we had an afternoon off, and the guy said, "Well, okay, I'm going to take you up to the mountains, the Ruwenzori Mountains, which look over over into Kenya,
right."
And on those mountains, they grow coffee. And so the guy said, okay, we're going to stop here in the coffee plantation, and there's a little guest house, and they'll serve you coffee. And the coffee is the stuff they grow on the hillside. And I was like, okay, I don't really drink coffee, but okay, it's fine. I'll try this coffee. So I drank the coffee, and it was a revelation.
Really?
Because it wasn't bitter. And it tasted really, really nice. It tasted almost chocolatey, very earthy, but almost chocolatey. And it was incredible. And I was like, everything that I've known up until now about coffee is wrong. It was all lies.
Right.
So I was like, okay, so how do you make this coffee? And they made the coffee in what's called a French press. And I was like, okay, this is amazing. And I need this in my life, because this feels like something very different and something exciting. So I bought, I think, probably a good 5 or 10 kilos worth of Ugandan coffee beans.
Wow. You managed to fit that in your suitcase on the way back?
Yeah, I brought them home with me. And from then on, I just started drinking that coffee. And obviously, eventually, I ran out of that coffee and I had to find another source. But I started making it at home. And I took the beans, I would grind the beans, and I would initially make them with a French press. And then I went on to get a coffee machine, espressos, and I had espressos. And so I kind of went through a journey. And initially, that coffee was amazing. And I went out and got other beans, and they weren't as good.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, that's really annoying, because I had that coffee that was really nice, and now the coffee that I buy is not as good. So I'm in search of this good coffee, because I know what good coffee tastes like. So I've kind of had my level set, and I think that is the point that people need to get to. So to your point, Mark, it shouldn't be bitter. Good coffee should not be bitter.
Oh, okay.
If you're drinking coffee that's bitter, it's not good coffee.
Okay.
That's interesting.
So, Starbucks, Caffeine.
okay.
I'm not going to say all the names anyway, and obviously they do things for a certain reason.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying anything against Starbucks. And if you enjoy drinking Starbucks coffee, great. But you'll notice that if you were to go into Starbucks and ask for a black coffee, it would be very bitter.
Yeah.
Almost all of Starbucks' best-selling drinks have sugar and milk in them. And sugar and milk were an introduction, in a European introduction to coffee. The Arabs and Muslims never put milk into their coffee.
Oh, right.
And that's also probably related to a biological function around lactose intolerance. But anyway, that's a completely different conversation. So Europeans put milk in to modify the taste of coffee, because if you over roast coffee, if you roast it too dark, it'll be bitter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You can make coffee from a dark roast bean and not make it coffee, make it bitter. It's more complicated and a longer conversation. But to make good quality coffee, you need to prepare it in the right way. You need to roast it in the right way, and if you do that, and it's good quality coffee, then you will get coffee that doesn't taste bitter, is very flavoursome, and actually is really nice. So all the coffee that I drink at home, I have without milk, without sugar. So I take it black. I have an espresso in the morning, and I use something called an AeroPress in the afternoon.
Wow.
And I will grind the beans, and I will make the coffee fresh from those ground beans.
So you grind the beans yourself, and you filter
I
it
don't
yourself?
I don't roast the beans.
Right.
You can buy green beans and roast them yourself at home. That's the next step. I'll probably start doing that this year. But you can do that as well. You can do that. But it's roasting beans is a tricky process, and you can certainly overdo it. Interestingly, in Ethiopian culture, there is a whole ritual around preparing coffee, which starts with taking green beans and roasting them at home over a fire in a small metal disc. Roasting the beans, crushing the beans, preparing the coffee, and then giving the coffee to the guests fresh. And that's that freshness that maintains the aromatics that give coffee its really good flavor. So you can have the generic flavor of coffee, but by preparing fresh coffee, you get the subtle flavors of coffee. And if you speak to the real coffee connoisseurs, and I'm not one of those real coffee connoisseurs, then they'll drink a cup of really good coffee, and they'll go, oh yes, notes of raisin and blackcurrant, and you go,
oh wow,
okay, it tastes kind of fruity. I'll accept that. And you can get those fruity notes. You can get chocolatey notes. You can get earthy notes. You can taste that in good coffee. You will taste that. If something's been very dark roasted, it's over processed essentially, then you're not going to get that. And most people will drink freeze dried coffee, which again was an invention, early 20th century invention, because of Brazilian overproduction of coffee. They were like, oh, well, all of this coffee beans are going to spoil. We need a way of being able to capture this coffee and still be able to sell it. So someone came up with a freeze drying process, and then they were able to export freeze dried coffee everywhere in the world.
How does that affect the caffeine?
So the caffeine content of the coffee remains pretty much the same,
right?
But the flavors, the aromatics in the coffee tend to be dispelled. So freeze dried coffee doesn't retain the same flavors as fresh coffee will. And Nescafe will tell you, or other producers of freeze-dried coffee. Not there. Others are available, but they all tell you that it tastes so you can get really good flavors from your freeze-dried coffee. Yeah, some will, but not most of them.
Yeah.
You mentioned that we've mentioned that there's so many different countries which do produce coffee, mainly
Yeah.
being Brazil. And you
Yes.
mentioned yourself, you got some from Uganda earlier
Yeah.
on. It was Yemen and Ethiopia. Is there any differences in coffee beans produced throughout the world? And is there differences in taste and quality even?
There have been books written on the different flavor profiles of
Oh,
different
okay.
coffees
Yeah.
around the world. And by all accounts, the things that make the difference are the quality of the soil, the altitude at which the coffee is grown, the amount of sunlight they receive, the nature of the water, the processing afterwards. So you pick the beans from the plant and then they need to be processed. So they need to be dried, and in some cases they're fermented and then they're dried. So all of these things will change the profile of the flavor of the coffee. And
Wow.
so,
Mm.
some people go, taste the coffee. Yeah, okay, that's from Kenya. I can taste that. That's East
Oh,
African
right.
coffee, typical, or Brazilian coffee, or
Yeah.
coffee from another part of the world. And so I think it's really fascinating. Certainly I would say that I can spot an East African coffee because
Mhm.
that's one I'm particularly familiar with, and I can spot it most of the time when I'm drinking it because it has a particular flavor, which is
So I just want to get this right. So obviously there's the different types of coffees. There's cappuccino, americano, mochas. So you're saying that the true and best coffee that you can get, or the most flavoursome, is that which is not bitter, without kind of sugar and milk, and preferably one which is kind of brewed from natural beans. Is that correct?
I'm going to caveat that by saying, in my opinion, because taste is a very personal thing, right? And
Yeah.
people are going to get very upset. They go, "Oh, I like my coffee with milk and sugar. It's how I
Yeah.
like it," and that's fine. If you like it and you enjoy it, then that's fine. But what I would say is there's a whole world of coffee flavor out there
Yeah.
which doesn't deserve to be disguised
Yeah.
Yes.
with milk and sugar, right? And
Right.
good, well prepared coffee should taste really, really nice. Should have a really good flavor and can be revealed by proper preparation of the right coffee beans. And if you do that, then you don't have to add anything to your
Yeah.
coffee, and it will taste really, really nice.
Yeah.
Having said that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having coffee with milk and sugar in it because that's a particular flavor, right? It's a
Yeah.
particular experience, and if that's what people enjoy, that's what they enjoy. I occasionally I will have coffee with milk and sugar in it, and there's a certain style of preparation of coffee from freeze dried coffee in Pakistan,
Mhm.
and there they'll do it. They'll do what they call paintna. So they will take a little bit of coffee, a little bit of water, and a little bit of sugar, and they will
Right.
whisk it up. They're aerating coffee, and
Right. Okay.
it's a fantastic physical process. If you watch it and you froth up the little bit of coffee, you froth it up,
Mm.
Yeah.
and what that does, it aerates it, and that expands the surface area to allow you to get the flavor of the coffee better. And then they'll add hot water to it, and then they'll give you this sweet, milky coffee, which has quite a strong coffee flavor to it. And well,
Mm.
if I'm in Pakistan, I'll have that coffee. People are offering it. I'm not going to say no. If they offer
Yeah.
me tea, I will say no. But if they offer me coffee,
Yeah.
I won't say no. So you can enjoy coffee however you want. But I guess the point is to say that there are ways of enjoying coffee without that, and there's a bigger world of coffee out there for people that want to discover it.
Definitely, yeah. It makes you want to just travel and go on an expedition to try all this coffee across the world. It's so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah,
I might take up the Uganda trip one day and just go with Humanity First one day. No, it's fascinating. We've had such a great discussion today, and definitely opened my eyes to the coffee world and even the history as well. It's such a rich history which the world's seen with coffee over 1,000 years of history, I'd say as well. But Jazakallah, Dr. Hammad, and it's been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We'll be delighted to have you on again. And I hope you have share the same feelings as well.
thank you. No, thank you to both of you for inviting me on the program. It's been, I mean, you can tell that I get excited talking about coffee. So
Yeah.
it's been really.
You rubbed that onto us as well.
Yeah, we might need to do kind of another episode for someone who's a tea connoisseur or enthusiast. So if someone is interested, do let us know and we can do an episode and perhaps a part 2 with you as well, Dr. Hammad. Thank you very much. Excellent. It's been a pleasure. Jazakallah.
Very good. Jazakallah.
Thank you for listening to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Visit our socials on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Al-Hakam Inspire. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments there. We would love to hear your feedback and thoughts, so send us an email to inspire@alhakam.org.